Hey guys, good afternoon. This is Mr. Krepps. Today I'm going to be talking with you about the treatment of women in the Middle East. I put together a short slideshow here. Um, don't feel very comfortable filming myself, so I decided to post a picture of me fishing in beautiful Lake Medora. It's up in the Upper Peninsula. That was in 2014. Mr. Brosite told me that if I grew out my mustache, that it would trend and that it would become more popular and that more people would do it. And he was wrong. He was big time wrong. I got home from this fishing trip. And my wife told me that I had to live in the garage before until I shaved that thing off. And so I haven't had one since. But as we talk about the Middle East, we've talked Syria and Saudi Arabia and Palestine and Israel and all that stuff. And one thing that the Middle East has in common, it doesn't have much in common, but one thing it does have in common is that it's very complicated. And the treatment of women in the Middle East is no different. It is very diverse. It's extremely harsh in certain areas, certain countries. One country may treat women very differently than another, and other countries might treat women, very well, kind of like Turkey. And so, what we're going to talk about here is why that is, how that relates to Islam, the religion, and I got a list of some of the worst countries where women can live, and we'll just work our way through this. I'm hoping to have this done in here in a few minutes. It's only a few slides, so let's talk a little bit about what we learned in Africa. They say that the Middle East is probably the worst place on the planet for women to live in regards to their treatment. We'll get into how they're treated in the next few slides. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, which I know my students studied. I'm not sure about, I know Mr. Veneman's students study it too. We learned about the rape of the Congo. That is another extremely dangerous place for women to live. But a majority of the countries where women are mistreated and allowed to be mistreated by their governments are located in the Middle East or countries that are very near the Middle East. Here's the list. And I have a map on the next slide, so we can go over that in a second. But if you notice, 6 of the 10, now this is a 2018 study from the World Economic Forum, 60% of the countries, the top 10 countries, are from the Middle East, are the countries that we've been studying here during this remote learning. Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Lebanon. And if you look at number 2, Pakistan, that is a country that they consider it to be in Asia, but it borders the Middle East. It's just east of Iran. So you could almost add that in with Afghanistan, which is just north of Pakistan. So the region in itself has a reputation, rightfully so, of mistreating women. So here's our map. We have Yemen down here, right? Iran, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and Iraq right here. And here's Pakistan. Here's the second worst place on the planet, according to that study. And here's Afghanistan. Now, how are these women being mistreated? First off, something called guardianship laws. Guardianship laws are laws in which women have to have permission of a man to do certain things. If you're unmarried, you are required to do as your father says. This includes leaving the house. Once you get married, that guardianship law is then passed to your husband. And you have very little rights besides the rights that your husband will allow you to have. There is domestic abuse. There is rape. It can be reported, but the government doesn't do anything about it. And women are threatened to, they're scared to report it because more domestic abuse will result. Very difficult to get a court ruling in favor of a woman in many of those countries if she brings charges against a man. Education or lack thereof education. Many women in some of these countries aren't allowed to learn to read. They're not allowed to go to school. They need to stay at home, look after their siblings, tend house. Dress code. Women are, and this is, remember, everything that I'm saying, that is not all the countries in the Middle East. These are the extreme countries, the countries that were just listed on the map. Dress code. Women are supposed to cover themselves. Some cover more than others. Some will cover their entire face where you can't even see their eyes. Others will cover their body, obviously, and then maybe their head, and they'll leave their face exposed. Women are restricted on traveling without their husband or without their father. Traveling abroad, freely traveling throughout the country. Female genital mutilation, which is a very dangerous procedure that's done on many young girls with the hopes of keeping them from wanting to have relationships with men. And then finally, voting, the lack of voting rights. And so if you can't vote, if you don't have a political voice, little change ever comes. And so then these women are just stuck in this cycle of never-ending abuse by the men in their community. Now, how does this relate to Islam? Well, it doesn't really exist in the Quran. This is, in most of these countries, are a majority Islamic, but it doesn't technically say to do these things to people in the Quran. The way that they're treating women in the Middle East is cultural. It's tradition. It's how women have been treated in the Middle East even before Islam was established by Muhammad around 300 AD. What happens is, though, people take on Islam. They take it as their new religion. They drop their old pagan religions, and now they consider themselves Islamic. And they twist the Quran. They interpret it to say that this is how they should treat women. This is right. This is wrong. They don't want to change their culture. They don't want to change their traditions. And that is somewhat understandable. We saw that here in the United States. Yeah, we saw that in the South with the Jim Crow laws. I mean, there were laws on the book that said that you were supposed to do this and supposed to do that, but the South stood strong and they did not want to change those laws until finally the Civil Rights Movement hit and they were forced to from the federal government. But with these cultures, and they're all different. And so that is why it is so diverse in the Middle East. And diverse within countries. There are certain villages. If you live in a city, if you're a woman in a relatively large city, even in Saudi Arabia, who gets a reputation for being a very bad place for women. Recently, women just got the right to drive, which is a good thing. But if you live in the cities, your life, as a woman, if you live in a big city, your life is much different than if you live in a tiny village out, away from the cities. And so they claim that it relates to Islam, but that is an incorrect claim by many of them. When Muhammad established Islam and he delivered the Quran, women actually gained more rights than what they had. The Quran does say, dress modestly, but it doesn't explicitly say exactly how you have to dress. The Quran allows women rights. It allows women to divorce their husbands. It allows them to refuse an arranged marriage. They can accumulate wealth and inherit property. But many of the cultures are reluctant to change, and we're seeing that today. Let's go back to this picture real quick. Now, this is an Afghan girl. So she's from Afghanistan. This picture was taken in the early 1980s. It made the cover of National Geographic. She's still alive. At the time, she was 13 years old. She was in a refugee camp in Pakistan. The Soviet Union attacked Afghanistan, and she fled with her family. Um, just a few years after this picture was taken, her father arranged a marriage for her and married her off. She was tracked down a few years ago by the man who took the photo for National Geographic. She's still living in Afghanistan. She never knew that her face was put on National Geographic for 40 years or so. So, interesting story. This really is a photo that it's iconic for women in the Middle East and how women are treated. And I actually think National Geographic did another photo of her recently as she grew older, and I think that worked out pretty well. So let's talk about what we're going to be doing for this lesson. 3 things. You watched my lecture, so that's good. Next, I have a 6-minute video for you to watch. It's called Women in the Middle East. It'll be uploaded to Google Classroom under the classwork section. Then there's an article that I want you to read called On Women's Rights, Unequal Progress in the Middle East. It's from the Washington Post. And then we have, it's a little bit different this week. There's going to be a couple questions that you have to respond to. They're written response questions. I'll try to limit it to no more than 5. Type those out, submit them to your teacher, and that'll be day 8 of remote learning. So I hope everybody's staying safe. I hope everybody's doing well. And if you have any questions, get a hold of us. Other than that, take care.